Good evening and welcome back to the second programme in the second series on coppers and brass. In this programme we're going to be looking at the issue of identity in Irish traditional music, whose music. And I'm delighted to say that we have in the studio a man who probably would bring a lot of understanding to that, and that's Danny Damon. Danny, you're very welcome.
Thanks for having me, Tommy.
Not at all, Danny. We'll be coming back to Danny in a second to explore this very fascinating topic, but in the meantime let's have a look at the views of some other people on the subject.
Music is music, and music was always there, and it was maybe used by certain elements as a banner, as a badge to show who they were. But the music they were using was music that belonged to everybody. And there's songs like The Bright Orange Heroes of Cumber. As we walked up and down on the road to Portadown, our drums we did rattle like the thunder. And as the day drew near, filled each Fenian heart with fear, for we're the bright orange heroes of Cumber. Come out, you black and tans, come out and fight me like a man. Show your wife how you won medals down in Flanders. Show them how the IRA made you run like hell away from the green and grassy lanes of Killashandra. Same tune, different sentiment.
The most iconic and famous of all orange tunes, the sash. A few bars that are instantly recognisable by the vast majority of people, you know, and its origins lie in music hall. The hat my father wore, an old music hall song, and before that, the original air is regarded as being an ancient Irish air. Marching bands became into being in Ireland because the British military were marching in Ireland, and people that were watching them or had been in them adopted that tradition. The first use of marching music in Ireland on a wide scale was probably with the Irish Volunteers.
A result of interest in Ulster Scots culture, that people have found a route back in, Protestants have found a route back into traditional music, and the things that there's an open door there. It starts off maybe as a single identity thing, but it's inevitable once you get stuck into the reality of what traditional dance music is, and the reality of what the song tradition and the dance traditions are like, that it's a very interwoven and complex Irish, English, Scottish, and American tradition. And that's all to the good.
I think my impression of the way things operate and did operate is in my own experience of learning traditional music in Belfast. If you really wanted to look into the religious background of the people that were doing it, of my particular bunch of influences and friends they were Catholic, Protestant, atheist, God knows what. They were just people that were linked by this raw bar of traditional music. They didn't really, I think people maybe subconsciously did avoid potentially sort of conflictual conversations about politics.
They were Protestants, they were Catholics, they were whatever they were, but they were musicians, and that's what they did. It wasn't an issue with them. The only problem was that sometimes people from outside the musicians community perceived them as being one thing or another, and the music began to be perceived as belonging to one side of the community, so the other side shouldn't get involved in it, and those that were involved in it should pull out of it.
50 years ago, what would be regarded as a ceilidh band would be the main entertainment in halls, in this hall and in halls like this, all throughout Ulster and indeed beyond, further down into the island. But as I said, it wasn't perceived to be being right that you could play this music which was being played almost in the name of something that was trying to destroy you or to overpower your own identity.
What happened with regard to the agreement and the outworking of the agreement was that the pie began to be recarved up in a way which really was at odds with the history of the tradition. And so while the peace process secured peace, there was instituted as a result kind of a war of ideas about who should play what music and who owned what type of music.
Irish traditional music really falls into line with what was happening to anything that was taking the label Irish. You know, Protestants in Ulster, Protestants in Northern Ireland, well, they perceived themselves to be under attack by a movement, a terrorist campaign, by people who were fighting in the name of Ireland, by people who were calling themselves Irish. And unionism just could not equate calling itself Irish whilst also adopting movements that claimed to be Irish. So there was a pulling away from Irish music, Irish identity, Irish culture.
Once it becomes divested of any sort of trappings of, political messages, which essentially it is anyway. It's not really, you're not expressing your political opinion by playing a reel,
But I think since the peace process has come in, I think people have begun to see that it does belong to everybody, and everybody has access to it, as they always had before. But now people are beginning to see that the music always was there and always belonged to everybody, and only certain elements were taking an angle on it. I hope that that's over.
Well, Danny, a wide range of views there.
Absolutely, yeah. Interesting stuff.
Yeah, we could be here all evening discussing them all. But before we do get into them, Danny, maybe you tell us a little bit about your own background, because I think that's very relevant to the subject.
Well, I probably cover a few areas there that we, other people did in those clips. My parents, both from the north, one Catholic and one Protestant. My grandfather, Leslie Bingham, my mum's dad, started playing the flute in the early 60s from a probably pretty conventional Protestant background, Northern Protestant background. Tara, my mother, then met Dermy, my dad, who plays the fiddle, and is from West Belfast, from Andytown. So they really came from two opposite sides in a conventional sense, and the music brought them together. And then they ended up moving to Dublin at the height of the Troubles, largely to get away from that kind of what they saw as a toxic environment, as opposed to be raising the family in, And so I was only a young child when I moved, and my sister, who's also a musician and singer, was born in Dublin, but we'd still have a kind of very northern influenced perspective, with all that background in the north.
And you where are you working now?
But myself, I work in the Irish Traditional Music Archive. I make field recordings and organise our collections of other people's field recordings that are given to us in Dublin. And I also work a bit as a musician, playing with a band called Morga and a duo called Danny and Oki, and a little bit on my own, under my own.
And good bands they are too.
Well, thank you.
As the theme of this subject arose from a conference which I was involved in 1989 or 1990, I think, in the Killashandra Hotel in Enniskillen, and the theme was traditional music, whose music. And at that time, we were a long way from the peace process. We were at the height of the Troubles and divisions, but the communities probably couldn't have been any further apart than they were then. And there was a lot of people came to the conference with different views, and it was a very tense moment in debating the origins of Irish traditional music and the perception that it seemed to be played by one community rather than another. We thought we'd revisit it now many years later, over 30 years later. There's been a peace process. I know you weren't around at the time, but knowing what you know of the time historically, do you think there's a change in attitude? Would you be aware that the Protestant community is more involved or less involved or the same in what we know as Irish traditional music?
It's an interesting question, and probably hard to give you a direct answer, but
or a short answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the people that I would have grown up with, friends of my parents or people who were around me growing up, who were from a Protestant background in the north, there are quite a few of them, and they're still the people that I see most often who are from that background, who play traditional music, Irish traditional music. I don't see a whole influx of young Protestant players, and it is something I notice. And maybe though me living in Dublin I'm a little disconnected. I'm not sure that could well be happening underground in the north, but that's my feeling for it, you know. And I think the peace process has caused there to be more funding available. There's more high-profile events. There's better venues. There's all this infrastructure around the music, but yet I'm not sure how it breaks through the barrier. If it does any better than it did 30 years previously. I feel that maybe the folk revival of the 60s and the kind of opening out of folk music and then Irish traditional music by extension drew in a lot of people from all types of backgrounds, including Leslie, my granda that I mentioned previously, and other family friends who still play away and have, you know, lived their lives in the music scene. But the subsequent troubles really threw up a big division
barrier.
between the communities, and I think there's still more work maybe to be done before that division is eroded and people can easily go back to playing whatever music or listen to whatever music they want, free of baggage, you know.
Interestingly, Quincy Dugan was making the point earlier that, which kind of begs an earlier question, and the one we're asking is, what is traditional music rather than whose music? And he was making the point that Irish traditional music, the Ceilidh band music, came after the marching band tradition, and the marching band tradition came out of the army garrisons, and many of the Ceilidh bands, the founding members had been part of marching bands that had been influenced by the British. So there's a whole context in which he's saying that his marching tradition is as much Irish as ours. Now, we're going to take a little break on that one, but in the meantime, I want to take another one of our weekly trips across the river to the cobblestones, and this time we're joined by Vinton Vallely, and Vinton is a man who has also written and spoken extensively on this issue, but this time he's going to reflect some thoughts on it through music, and we're going to listen to a very appropriate march that tells a tale.
Do one more. It's the it's a tune which has jumped ship many times, which I taught to all of you. One time. It's called the Shanghai March, which is echoes in all sorts of other tunes, jigs, reels.
Well, that was Vinton in his inimitable style, playing a tune and using the tune to demonstrate that the one melody line can have two different community contexts, for want of a better word. There's probably no finer dissertation on this whole issue of identity in Irish traditional music than Vinton's book, Tuned Out. So those who want to learn and go into this in greater detail, I highly recommend that book. Anyway, Danny, before the break, we were talking about the point that Quincy Dugan raised, which was around the issue of not about identity in music, but the actual music itself. What is Irish traditional music? And essentially, he was making the point that the marching band tradition that he's part of in Northern Ireland actually predates, say, the Cayley music movement or the session music movement, music for want of a better word. And he's saying that tradition came out of the army garrisons all around the island of Ireland, and the local people picking up musical instruments and tunes and marching tunes. A lot of the tunes that came across, polkas and jigs and that, weren't intrinsically Irish. They came in predominantly, but not exclusively, by the British Army, and therefore they have maintained a tradition that we have sort of erred or lost in. Any views on that one?
It's a very interesting point, and it's another of these quite open-ended issues, I think. Like, there's definitely something in it, and I've heard Fintan himself speak similarly before, Fintan Valdey, who you mentioned there, about the evolution of Irish traditional flute playing, the role that marching bands played in that. Flute bands, they were not only garrison based, of course, and they were endemic across the whole of the island in the late 1800s, you know, and the wooden flute that we play today can be seen by many people as a kind of a legacy from that era, you know, from that music. But I'd say the repertoire, I'd say definitely marching band music in the north could well predate, say, session music, which is really a product of, you know, the 1950s on, really, Irish people going to London and all that, different outlet evolving for their music. But look, even further back in time than the origin of the marching music, you've got Celtic harp music, you've got Turlough Carlin, you've got Shannon songs from the 1700s and poetry, and that connects into. There's another tradition underlying there. That tradition, the bardic tradition, feeds into the traditional dance music we play today in a different form. You know, some of the jigs might be the air of a Shannon song that's a poem from the 1700s by Owen Roe or O'Sullivan or one of these guys. The marching band music also feeds into it, as does Scottish music. Neil Gow tunes being played by fiddle players in Dublin in a session now. You know, it's just a big mixture of loads of different influences. So it's not really, in my opinion, a case of the music, one person's being older or more authentic maybe, or that they own the real thing, or the other person also feels that. Everyone owns a big mixture of everyone else's music, and that's it, you know. So
are you saying that there's a broader context than the purely divide between Catholics and Protestants to traditional music? There's a broader global issue around identity.
Well, I think once anyone claims kind of possession or rights on a tradition, and these traditions are very organic and they don't really allow for easy definition, and if someone can claim some type of ownership on the music, but once you delve into it in any detail, the picture always gets a lot more complicated, and usually the questions get unanswerable, you know. So, and it's complicated, as you in your question there, even further complicated these days with information revolution in the world in general, and availability of music, call it, you know, of Irish traditional music on a global basis. You get people from anywhere and everywhere hooking into it, all different identities of theirs being brought to bear on it, different ways of playing, different preferences, musical preferences and all that, feeding into it, getting more commercialized as well, dictating back to the people playing it how to evolve their music. So many different things going on. In a way, if you look at it in that scale, it puts an interesting perspective on the issues in the north of Ireland.
Actually, Danny, a lot of the issues you've raised, like the broader context we are picking up in forthcoming episode on boundaries of Irish traditional music, which is part of the same question: whose music and what music? So that there are many overlapping things. But in conclusion, even though those wider contexts are ones which need to be addressed and researched and debated, do you live in hope that more people from the unionist community might get involved in traditional music as the peace process deepens and hopefully the situation, community relations issues improve?
Absolutely, yeah. And I've seen, great initiative. This is just one example of where you can find hope. This book, Handed Down, by Nigel Boulier.
Yes.
Seen it yourself?
Yes,
it deals with
book.
the music in North County Down, where half of my family roots are, and I've seen up there that the local tradition, and I'd be hesitant to call it Irish for fear of offending people's sensibilities, but it's traditional music, fiddle based mostly tradition, great music, great tunes, but with the polarization of everything in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the older musicians were dying away. People were afraid. It was so laden with identity and meaning that people coming up were afraid to get to play it, to carry it on, and it's really in danger of dying out. So even if young people could feel comfortable with getting into that type of tradition that they can really see as their own, but the more they get into it, maybe it would draw them into the broader tradition that all feeds into, and they could meet fiddle players who play Irish music, and maybe the two of them could find they have tunes in common and evolve away from there. That would be fantastic to see. Yeah,
that's a good hopeful message they end up on. It's a great book, and it's a great chapter of that whole issue that I think everybody should have a look at. Danny, I want to thank you for coming in and help us with what is a very, very complex issue in a very short period of time. And I want to thank you and your family who've given so much to traditional music, or whatever way you want to describe it, on this island for at least a couple of generations, 3 generations now.
3
and hopefully more.
Yeah.
But thanks very much, Danny.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate it. It's great to have you along. That was Danny, and I think you'll agree it's a fascinating subject which we can't do credit to in the short period allotted here, but nonetheless one well worth keeping an eye on. Next week we're going to explore an issue arising from this conversation, Danny, which is the impact of immigration on Irish traditional music, and we're delighted to have Peter Woods along to help us with that. He'll bring some very personal, informative views on that. In the meantime, keep playing, keep whistling, take care, slán.